What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson, and this episode, I'm dropping audio from a talk that I gave recently, like 2 days ago, I think, at the Pacific Center for Island Security in Guam. They convened what I think is the first ever Security for Micronesia group, and one of the problems that you have if you're in a place like Guam is that you are inundated with Washington and Canberra type think tankers who have their own agenda. They're literally agents of the national security state, and they have a very blinkered, self-serving point of view, and they view the island nations very instrumentally. And so this particular meeting was like a combination in-person thing plus webinar with some outside experts. So I got to be part of this. It was, of course, my honor. And I have the actual sort of audio presentation stuff. But I wanted to put a little preface, introduction, before turning you straight to the audio, because occasionally I'll use terms in here or acronyms that might not be familiar. So PIF is Pacific Islands Forum, FSM is Federated States of Micronesia, and the sub-region that Guam exists in is called Micronesia. So the Pacific Islands are comprised of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. The Micronesian sub-region has within it a state that's called FSM, the Federated States of Micronesia. So for outsiders, maybe that can be confusing. But anyways, that's mostly what you should need to know acronym-wise. There's, on the Undiplomatic newsletter, there are slides that accompany this talk that I'll put up. It was a good discussion, Q&A afterwards as well. The big thing here is that I'm talking about Sino-U.S. rivalry and how it intersects with the Pacific Islands, with the Blue Pacific, and specifically with Micronesia. And I put a bunch of new arguments on the table that are research-based that have not been in circulation before. So there actually is a lot in this that's new. This is not a stock talk. It might be controversial in that sense, but at any rate, I hope you enjoy. And I think next week we'll have the Variety Normal Show back. But in the meantime, enjoy this. Peace. Thank you. Hafade, kia ora, what's good, everybody? Thanks for having me to discuss today some stuff that might be controversial depending on your point of view, but I'm going to make my argument as clearly as I can, and then we'll see what happens. Can we go to the next slide, please? So if you're interested in what I have to say here and you want to go deeper, it's all coming from this collection of research that I've published over the last 2 years or so, more or less. And the slide is just kind of giving an indicator, these are the receipts in case I've piqued your curiosity or perhaps your rage, depending on who you are. Next slide, please. So everybody has probably seen a version of this statement 1,000 times. And then right after I got invited to speak with PCIS today, I saw this thing in Reuters, which is very fresh, just a couple weeks ago. And it was frustrating because of how common this sentiment is. So it's easy to draw equivalencies between China and the US because they're both big powers. They're both not local to the region. They're not organic powers, right? They both care about their own interests above all others, of course. But the conventional wisdom that both great powers seek dominance of the Pacific is a false equivalency. Right now, that's not true. Over the past 10 years, that has not been true. So one of the things I want to convey today is a greater sense of realism about what China seeks versus what the US seeks and what the interplay of that really means. And I'm concerned with this because a tragic sensibility about the world is what leads people to embrace missiles and bases and troops and mass violence, right? The tragic sensibility is what justifies secrecy and denying people civil rights and denying people self-determination. And if you believe the statement on this slide that everybody's trying to dominate you, then you very easily end up with a kind of tragic view of the world that embraces militarism. And that would be a mistake, not just morally, but like strategically, analytically. So next slide, please. So my bottom line up front, there's a couple points that I'm going to make here, but the bottom line is that China is less of a threat than ordinarily supposed. And that doesn't mean that it's a benign actor. And they certainly don't have Micronesia's best interests at heart. But you have to make sense of what China does in the context of U.S. hegemony, which is rapidly declining. And the failure to do that makes China look like it's this, mustache twirling evildoer bent on conquest. And that's not real. That's a caricature. And then the other big conclusion here is that Micronesia has a sovereignty deficit. And that sovereignty deficit is an acute source of insecurity for the region. And in the case of Guam and CNMI, this is pretty obvious, right? They're just straightforwardly denied self-determination. So they don't get to exercise sovereignty, but they are also not full equals in the US federal system. But for the compact nations, this is also true. For Palau and for FSM and the Marshall Islands, they're independent states, but the compacts of free association are by definition sphere of influence arrangements. They are contracts that voluntarily concede partial sovereignty in the realm of national security and foreign policy, which is typically the sole responsibility of an independent state. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I have to get a little bit wonky at the outset here, talk about an IR concept of the security dilemma, right? A classical security dilemma involves two states that misperceive each other's intentions. And because of that, each tries to secure itself at the expense of the other. But in doing that, they make themselves and the other less secure. It's a dilemma because neither state actually wants to conquer the other, but in trying to secure themselves from aggression, they undermine the other side's security, which then undermines their own security because they end up in this spiral of escalating tension, right? So the way that the great powers relate to the Pacific has some elements of a security dilemma, but it's a very unbalanced security dilemma. And a few notable features of it are, one, strategists in China and the US see the Blue Pacific region as a geopolitical buffer, or they want it to function as that purpose for them. And I have research about this that I'll talk about in a minute, but US strategists in particular think of the Pacific as a frontier, which has massive implications that are generally not good. Two, the Pacific is a space that is militarily dominated by mostly the US, and the source of that domination is its military positioning in Hawaii combined with its control of Micronesia. And then three, China controls nothing in the Pacific, nothing, except for some sovereign debt, right? And so the reason I hesitate to describe the Pacific as a model security dilemma between the great powers is that the US in this region has no right, no standing to be afraid of China. In the Taiwan Strait, there's a little bit of a different story, which we could talk about, but in the Pacific, it's just a lot of paranoia. That's it, right? If you look at the material reality and what the US really fears, it's not China in this region. It's a lack of US control. Pardon my French. That's the kind of shit you go to therapy for. So next slide, please. And so the US says its goal in the Pacific is this phrase, strategic denial. This is, everybody who talks geopolitics in the Pacific has heard this phrase many times. It's considered the ultimate real purpose and goal or whatever. That is a category error. It is not correct. What the US wants and what it practices is exclusionary control of Micronesia. The US wants your sub-region as its exclusive sphere of influence. It basically has that now, but it also doesn't want to lose that. And because that, an exclusive sphere of influence, because that preserves a favorable imbalance of power, they seek it. Because that provides the US defense in depth militarily, they seek it. Because that provides a platform for US power projection into East Asia, they seek it. It being exclusionary control of Micronesia. China, by comparison, it also would like defense in depth if we're talking about, strategy brain. China also wants a geographic buffer. But most of all, China wants to weaken or dilute U.S. domination. And if your goal is U.S. primacy, that's a bad thing. That sounds like a problem, right? But if your goal is just stability, what China wants is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, what it wants could change, but what it wants, as far as we know, is not necessarily a bad thing if your goal is stability. So at the level of strategy, there is a conflict of interest here between China and the U.S., but it's unbalanced. It's not an inevitable conflict of interest. And the U.S. side of the conflict is much more maximalist, much more exclusionary than the Chinese side of the conflict. Next slide, please. So when you see mostly like U.S. and Australian analysts freaking out about China, they can't freak out on the basis of Chinese military bases because there are none, right? They can't freak out about China controlling the sovereignty of any of these nations because it doesn't. It can't even freak out about a compact of free association, even in a place like the Solomons, because it doesn't have any, right? And so the biggest aspects of China's presence in the larger region here that serves as a source of fear or threat perception, it's related ultimately to like foreign assistance, police presence, and migration. And I want to quickly touch on each of these three elements because if these are the indicators of Chinese intentions toward the Pacific, what they indicate is that China is not interested in hegemony or exclusionary control here. I do think Chinese domination would be a bad thing. I don't think that's something we have to seriously worry about anytime soon. Next slide, please. So there's a lot I could say about this, but for the sake of time, most Chinese aid goes to Polynesia and Melanesia, not to Micronesia, with the exception of like FSM for the most part. And the reason for that is obviously that Micronesia relies more on the US. And the thing that's notable here is that Chinese aid to the Pacific, most of which comes in the form of financing for Chinese projects and Chinese workers, it peaked around 2016, okay? To put that differently, Chinese aid started to decline just as great power competition was starting to become a thing. So, if grand strategic calculations were driving China's foreign aid, then those investments would not be declining at the very moment of peak great power competition. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff going on this slide, but the chart in the corner shows that Chinese police presence and security assistance has been rising in the Pacific Islands. And there's at least two things to note about that. One is that the timing of the rise in China's security-oriented engagement with the Pacific, it coincides with the onset of great power competition, right? 2015, 2016, around there. You can see it in the data that China did not feel a real need to securitize its engagement with the Pacific until the US started bringing its national security attention to the Pacific again. The second thing to note here is that there's an interplay between Micronesia and Melanesia, and Polynesia to some extent as well. US control of Micronesia is not really contested. Like Chinese capitalists and agents of the Chinese state, onesie twosies, they've tried to buy a politician here or there, right? There's a famous case of this very recently in FSM. But A, China does that everywhere it can, right? B, the money that it was offering in the Micronesian examples of this kind of corruption is pittances. It's small money, small dollars. And so C, if China's goal had really been to divide and conquer, it was not trying very hard, right? And I mention this because China's interests in the Pacific are small compared to its interests in most other regions. But since the flag usually follows trade, as Beijing begins to worry about its interests in the Pacific, it faces a reality that it cannot direct that security assistance that it would provide. It cannot direct it to Micronesia because of US exclusionary control. It's literally not allowed, right? So Chinese security engagement gets directed toward Melanesia and Polynesia. And so there's this policing arms race in the Pacific, where Australia and New Zealand and France and the US, they're plowing security resources into pretty much any Pacific nation that wants it. And Australia has been very explicit that this is intended to be a counter to China. Australia is spending billions on policing Melanesia and Polynesia so that those sub-regions don't accept, it's trying to crowd out Chinese security assistance, right? All of that, though, is a spillover effect of US control of Micronesia. As a counterfactual, like, if the US did not dominate Micronesia and if it did not use Micronesia as like a giant platform for power projection, I don't think this policing arms race in Polynesia and Melanesia would be happening at all. But at a minimum, it wouldn't be as acute as it currently is, right? And more generally, like, it's really bad that foreign assistance for island nations primarily takes the form of bilateral militarized security assistance, because that kind of undermines Pacific regionalism for one thing, right? If it's not being routed through the PIF, it's being routed around the PIF by definition. But that kind of aid also deflects from the need to address the sovereign debt crisis, youth unemployment, climate adaptation, non-military sources of economic growth. The things that actually make life harder for islanders cannot be meaningfully addressed as long as foreign support primarily focuses on sort of bilaterally provided police and military security, regardless of what nation is providing it, right? Next slide, please. So the other source of Chinese influence that the West worries about is tied to Chinese migration one way or another, right? It's very much like transnational basket. And there's real evidence for it. So like human trafficking, visa fraud, illegal migration, cyber crimes. It's real, but none of that is what I would call strategic. Those activities are not being directed by Xi Jinping. As far as I know, they're not being directed by the PLA. And even if they were, the totality of those kinds of transnational illicit activities do not threaten Micronesia's existence. They don't threaten Micronesia's power position in the world economy, except through how the US reacts to those activities. So again, it's the interplay of the great powers that's the real problem here, right? And to put Chinese migration in context, it accelerated with the Belt and Road Initiative because BRI subsidized Chinese workers in agriculture, real estate, construction, and retail, right? But BRI is slowing because Chinese growth rates are declining. China has less surplus capital to throw around as its growth rate declines, right? But also because the party itself, the CCP, is encouraging existing surpluses to be redirected toward domestic investment. And so the Chinese state doesn't have to promote immigration abroad because it has imbalances at home that drive immigration organically, right? China has a youth unemployment crisis and housing affordability crisis. And of course, we all have those things, but China has them at scales that we don't, right? And as China's economy moves up the value chain, which it's doing very rapidly and which most of us are not, right? As that happens, China's low-skill manufacturing jobs spin off to cheaper places like Vietnam. And those low-skill workers are suddenly out of a job as that happens. Those workers become surplus laborers. And who usually migrates illegally? Surplus labor. Next slide, please. So domestic conditions in China are causing Chinese migration to everywhere. And migration to Micronesia is simply part of that trend. It's not some anomaly in the data, you know? And so what that means is that we don't have any evidence basis to conclude or assume that there are nefarious strategic intentions driving the presence of Chinese citizens in Micronesia. Illicit activity, a certain amount of it, is going to accompany any large migration population. That's just sort of like built, you have to like discount that or build that in, right? That's kind of what we're seeing, right? But it's not the mustache twirling malign grand strategy thing, right? Chinese migration becomes a strategic problem for Micronesia only insofar as, one, the U.S. securitizes immigration and then treats it as a reason to start escalating like ICE raids in Guam or on neighboring islands, or two, if the U.S. starts restricting Chinese tourism access to Micronesia on national security grounds. That becomes a strategic issue because it would choke off the ability for your economy to function, right? And there's a version of that battle playing out right now in CNMI. I think some of you probably are aware of that. But in both of those cases, the securitization of migration is not being done by China. It's being done by the U.S. That's just important to keep in mind. Can we go to the next slide, please? So that's the bit I have to say about China. And I think that if you put on a geopolitical lens, you could argue credibly that China seeks what's called strategic space in the Pacific. But that is a much more modest goal than hegemony or domination or exclusionary control. You really need to put that in relation to the U.S. side of all of this for it to really make any sense. So I've written about this elsewhere. U.S. grand strategy comes closest to something called primacy. Primacy is a strategy that has three core attributes, right? This is how you know it's primacy, right? One is a favorable imbalance of power or military overmatch. Two, a focus on great powers as priority threats. And then three, the use of state power to contain or weaken other great powers. That is very straightforwardly U.S. statecraft, right? That sounds like Biden administration stuff. That sounds like what's happening right now. That sounds like what was going on in the Obama administration to a certain degree, right? That's just what U.S. grand strategy comes closest to. Facts. Next slide, please. So in the Pacific, the U.S. has military superiority by a massive margin. A child would know this, right? What it claims to want, like I said earlier, strategic denial. To say that is to say you want to prevent the hegemony or domination of any other power. That's what is implied by strategic denial, right? But if you look at what the U.S. does in Micronesia, it goes way beyond what strategic denial would require. If you have military superiority in a specific geographic space, denial is built in. You don't have to do a whole lot. You probably don't have to do anything different, right? And I have, I have research that came out just last week about this, and the upshot of it was that the language of strategic denial is a category error. It's the wrong description. It's a language that sanitizes how the U.S. practices power politics. And what the U.S. practices in this region is exclusionary control of Micronesia. The U.S. wants to be able to take military actions here. New radar sites, refurbished runways, relocating forces, firing range complexes. Those kinds of actions, Micronesian nations are not in a position to veto them, and no other country can be allowed to do them. That is the definition of exclusionary control. So, U.S. strategists and war planners, and I was one for what it's worth, they think they need exclusionary control of Micronesia because they see the Blue Pacific itself as this massive strategic frontier. And in geopolitics, frontiers are spaces of exception that become sponges for violence, right? To think of a place as a frontier is to impose on it both like a kind of threat and opportunity. And the opportunity for the frontiersmen, the outside powers, right? The opportunity is to profit or to extract from the frontier in ways that you cannot do in normal politics, because governance is not the same as it would be in normal politics or at home, right? But the threat that comes with recognizing a frontier, perceiving a frontier. Frontiers are not natural, that you conjure them up in your mind and then you say that place is a frontier. Screw the people that are there, right? They're not there. That's the thing, terra nullius, right? Even when it's not. But the threat of designating a frontier, the logic of it is that if you don't control it, then somebody else will, and that would put you at a positional disadvantage. So the perceiving of the Pacific as a power vacuum makes the U.S. want to control what it can. And so it's actually extremely problematic for Micronesia itself that Washington think tankers, Beltway intellectuals think of this place as a frontier. Think of your home as a frontier, because frontiers are places where you dump violence, military violence and structural violence. Next slide, please. So this is why Micronesia's sovereignty deficit is a problem. It is not a strategically autonomous region. The U.S. exercise of exclusionary control of Micronesia is directly because Guam and CNMI are unincorporated territories. It's directly because the 1979 Treaty of Friendship with Kiribati says explicitly no third parties without U.S. approval, right? It's directly because Palau, FSM, and the Marshall Islands have these compacts that constrain not only their foreign policy and their national security, but their economic possibilities too. Ask them how, PRC tourism is going. So from a strategic perspective, what good is this, right? The best thing that you can say about the compacts is that they are mechanisms for bloc politics, but bloc politics is the basis of great power war. And so the irony here is that the compacts are meant to provide security, but they generate insecurity because they forfeit the region's strategic autonomy. I mean, look, great powers are inherently narcissistic. If we're realistic about China, I think we have to see that China cares about China first and foremost. And I should say too, we cannot know anybody's intentions in the future. It hasn't happened yet, right? So Chinese intentions today don't involve any plans of conquest in the Pacific, and that could change, it's true. But at the same time, what we know right now is that China's goal is for strategic space, and that pushes back against the U.S. in this region because the U.S. uses its control of Micronesia for power projection into East Asia, right? And so why does all this matter? Because the Pacific cannot be a buffer between outside powers if it appears to be controlled by one side or the other. In that case, the Pacific becomes an object or an asset or a weapon, right? And that only heightens insecurity. And so I mentioned this earlier, and it's taboo to talk about, but Micronesia's sovereignty deficit is a source of the security assistance arms race in Melanesia and Polynesia. The sovereignty deficit allows U.S. strategists to design force postures that China finds threatening. And to the extent that the U.S. is able to use its presence in Micronesia to limit how much damage the U.S. homeland would absorb in a war with China, well, that doesn't help deterrence either, right? That encourages arms racing. And so there's this phrase, damage limitation. When Ankit talks to you, he might mention it. It makes it sound like Micronesia is a shield or like it serves as a defensive purpose for the U.S., but that's not the whole story, right? Missile defense sounds like it's a defensive purpose, but there's no evidence that missile defense has ever deterred an attack. And when the U.S. started developing missile defense in the Cold War, the Soviets didn't see it as a shield. They saw it as a spear, as part of a spear, because it was part of a larger war plan. It didn't exist in isolation, right? And so the Soviets saw missile defense as provocative, as threatening, and it became a reason for them for why they needed to do more arms racing, basically. It was because missile defenses were limiting the damage that the Soviet arsenal could do. And that meant that their deterrent felt less effective, so they needed to expand their arsenals more. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? I feel like this is kind of an impossible question, right? Based on my assessment, the primary goal has got to be ending Sino-US rivalry, which is outside the scope of probably what the Pacific can achieve on its own, but also strategic autonomy for Micronesia. And so it's fine to oppose a Chinese sphere of influence, but if you support a US sphere of influence, you're just accelerating China's bid for a sphere of its own. You can have really sound reasons for supporting a US sphere of influence. That doesn't mean that the consequences won't come visit you, right? You will be accelerating China's bid for a sphere of influence of its own. And that's what's playing out right now. So when we see things like military Keynesianism, the burden of sovereign debt servicing, the compacts of free association themselves, all of these things limit the ability of maneuver for actors in Micronesia to be strategic actors, right? And this, I believe, is profoundly against the American interest. I think the way U.S. strategists conceive of the Pacific is profoundly self-defeating for the U.S., right? The thing that most benefits America, I think, would be a kind of strategic autonomy for Micronesia. America has a place here, can have access, right? But inclusion rather than exclusionary control. Next slide, please. So there are other things that would be beneficial to do. We can talk about all this stuff too in the Q&A if you want, but none of this matters very much if the region is part of an exclusionary hierarchy. And this is just my honest assessment. I have some thoughts too about like the comparison of Micronesia and Hawaii, but I'm almost positive I've gone on longer than I planned, so I should probably stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very provocative in many ways, and we're grateful for your presentation and your thoughtfulness in bringing Micronesia into the centrality of this conversation. So, Ken, do we have any questions?
First, I'll leave it to Security of Micronesia group members. Any questions for the floor? Okay, Senator.
Hi, Dr. Jackson. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. There's so many things I can relate to. I'm from Saipan, so I'm watching everything play out, according to what you've been saying. I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about how do we get around, and I noticed at the very end there you said signal local activists or something like that you had in your presentation.
Yeah.
Signal boost, yeah. So it's really common, when you say stuff in the CNMI about what you were talking about in terms of Chinese influence, or if you're critical of U.S. militarization, to just immediately be like inundated with you must work for China, like there must be some reason you're being critical of the military for this in this way. And so I just wondered, like, what are your go-arounds? Like, how do you respond to that? I mean, this is a really kind of practical, because it's kind of a practical concern kind of on the ground, but it's legitimate in the sense that is the sentiment in the CNMI. And so I wondered what is your kind of advice in that front?
Yeah, it's a serious problem. That at the core of it, though, an accusation is not an argument. You know what I mean? So like, it's not a credible rebuttal or whatever to activist demands to be like, you're working for the CCP. Like in the Cold War, the US literally went after labor unions in what is now the third world, including in places like New Zealand and Fiji, went after them as, national security threats or whatever. But it was because the labor unions were making demands that were aligned with what the Soviet Union wanted in this zero-sum battle between the Soviet Union and the US. But that's a lost cause. Like, the zero-sum battle was a thing that was like not good for anybody. It sacrificed a lot of people. And the process of like giving into those national security impulses, that coloring, that framing, accepting the accusation instead of recognizing it as red baiting, basically racist, it's denying agency. It's denying the ability to dissent. What kind of democracy is that? It's one thing to like strategize what are your communication talking points, but at root, it's baseless, the accusation that like, if you have local demands for autonomy or for reparation of some kind or anything other than weapons, then you're in the pocket of the CCP. That's not serious. It's not serious.
Ben, some of the points you make, particularly in reference to the threat of China, I think you call it the China threat cottage industry, in which seems to be not just a way of thinking about China, but it's just used to, as you pointed out, make accusations or create the impression that if you're not full on board, with this exclusion zone that you are somehow in the service of China. And I think we've seen that, particularly in reference to Saipan, where the migrants that have come from Saipan, that come on boats to Guam and land on the northern shores of Guam, are instantly kind of ginned up in the Washington, D.C. area, as if these were individuals that were spies, or they're involved in some kind of espionage, when they're just really, they're not nice people, they're ordinary criminals, but they're, and I try to tell people, well, China's a pretty sophisticated country. If they were going to engage in espionage, they wouldn't plant,
they're not sending their best.
They wouldn't put 50 people in Saipan and send them over in boats, and everything seems to go in that direction. And yet, still, even when you explain that to people, there's still this fear, this notion that somehow or other the preeminence of U.S. military presence is the only real antidote to Chinese ascendancy, as opposed to civic stability.
Yeah. I mean, military Keynesianism is a hell of a drug. Like, I think it's just the reality that Micronesian economies depend on U.S. presence in various ways that are not structurally healthy. The military spending, there's studies about this out of Brown University, the Costs of War Project. Like, military spending is not an efficient source of jobs. Like, the job multiplier effect for every $1 million spent on the military has a lower job multiplier effect than $1 million spent on any other sector: education, infrastructure, public health, whatever. But you're being immediately offered, well, do you want this money or not? Do you want this aid or not? Do you want this, extra housing or not? And that kind of stuff, that's the wrong frame. That's the frame they want to present to you, because they see this place as a frontier and they have a strategic use for it. And so they need you to accept that frame. The reality of it, though, is that military Keynesianism in the U.S. is why America is a functional oligarchy now. It's why the billionaires took over. It's why the working class is immiserated in the U.S. We have diverted so much public welfare. We've sacrificed economic democracy and the promise of it and broken the back of American labor so that we can have military primacy. And the military primacy is a kind of, I don't want to say it's an original sin here, but it's a core problem. Because if your goal is primacy, if you need to sustain a favorable imbalance of power in a region like East Asia, which is so far from the US, you do need to be able to leverage the Pacific. You really do. And so this is why it's useful to understand how does the ruling class think? How does the national security state think, right? Because their aim is primacy, even when they deny the label, they'll call it other things sometimes. But because primacy is what they seek, they've got to control Micronesia as much as they can. So within their own logic, they're doing something that makes sense. But what I see is that it's producing an outcome that's actually counterproductive for them, but also it exploits the hell out of you.
All right, we have some questions on Zoom, so we'll go to Ken.
Hey, Van. Sorry, my voice is shot. I'm going to read you about 2 to 3 questions. You can take them, answer whichever one you want, just some from the audience. One question: with the history of the Pacific through wars and the fact that our islands were invaded by larger powers that you seek us to be independent from, how do you suggest Micronesia seek independence but then be able to defend itself during wars between those powers? History tells us the Pacific does not fend well. We were on our own during war outbreaks. The other question: what opportunity does the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima play to assist the signal boost of community activists? How can we address the U.S. rhetoric of nukes won the war and deterrence has maintained the peace? So you can take any of those, answer any of them you like.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I was trying to focus in the presentation on, they're both good questions. I was trying to focus on, like, what is it that China actually wants? Because if you present somebody with a scenario where you say, okay, you're in your bedroom at night, suddenly the alarm goes off, you hear somebody break in, you've got a knife, they're raping your wife and they're stealing your jewelry. What do? Can you defend yourself? What do you have to call on somebody, right? If you define a scenario that's narrow enough, tight enough, insane enough, you will put yourself in a position where you make the only answer completely depending on some other guy with a gun, right? And you can wrap it in history if you like, but we're not arguing about history. We're arguing about what does China seek versus what does the U.S. seek, and what is the U.S. doing right now? What is, like, the entire conceit of, like, history tells us kind of logic? The entire assumption there is that America is benign for your purposes, which by this point you should know is not fully true, and also that China is malign toward your existence and wants to conquer you. And there's just no basis in fact for that. There's not. It's not Imperial Japan. We do have to right size take seriously an analysis of what China seeks and what are the motivations and what are the origins of those motivations. Like, why are they happening? You know? So that's why I tried to focus as I did. I can't remember the other question.
For that, I think it's along the same lines. One of the things that shorthand ways that we hear sometimes arguments that are made are, we heard this given in a briefing here provided by the military. The question is, do you want to continue to speak English or do you want to learn Chinese? And it is so absurd on its face, yet it grabs people's attention, and it is kind of a cottage industry. John, did you have a question? We have one last question here from John Maffel of YAP.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jackson. Let me begin by this quote from one of our statements from the island of Yap, where I'm from. He says, I am forced to point out that the United States of America we are bargaining with. It is the United States of America we are bargaining with. They fought a civil war over their unity. Now they're encouraging disunity in Micronesia. Apparently they believe in things like the democratic process and unity only for themselves and not for other peoples and nations. Because one of the points when you were talking about solutions, possible solutions, was some kind of regional cooperation for us. And obviously at one point we were coming to the table as a region, but we had different interests. Guam was always never really at the table as far as the U.S. was concerned. CNMI went their own way, RMI, Palau. The leftover islands became federal states of Micronesia. So in practical terms, in realistic terms, given our diverse interests and even levels of development, what steps do you really see as far as trying to get that regional cooperation and communication going forward? Because, even economically, we don't even have something established. It took people like the Pacific Island Forum for us to kind of get in on that. But regionally, we do have things like APIL for the different parliaments. But you see, as far as in practical, realistically.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Good question. There's not like a clear solution, but if you make the demand, obviously far more diplomatically than anything I've said here, but if you make the demand of the U.S. to work with Micronesian nations as a bloc, it forces them to take the mask off and just be a bad guy and own it and make them tell you guys to F off, in which case you know what kind of monster you're dealing with, and that can give you leverage with your own people. Or it puts them in the position to say, oh, actually, why are we dividing and conquering this region that we say we're trying to protect? Maybe we should live up to our own ideals, because American ideals are, I think, valuable and worth holding up and worth cherishing. And I think the major failing of America is that it too often ignores its own ideals. The gap between ideals and reality is impossibly large. And so our demands ought to be to close those gaps, you know? And so making the demand of the US in a, you know, I don't know what the leverage would be. This is the missing piece, but at least putting the request to them to show that, like, hey, we're unified in so many different ways. Why are you negotiating us bilaterally like this, where it's just, we have no say and we're put in the disadvantage, you know? CNMI's governor is having this negotiation about the visa issue for Chinese tourists, and the governor's counterpart is not even a cabinet secretary or a deputy secretary or an undersecretary or an assistant secretary. It's not even a deputy assistant secretary. It's a senior advisor. That's the lowest level political appointment in government. That's ridiculous. That's an imbalance. That shows a kind of chauvinism, like an unseriousness. If you were negotiating as a bloc, they would be forced to take you a little more seriously, and that would be to your benefit. It's not clear that they would be willing to let that happen. But if they don't let that happen, after you show unity and present them with the request or the demand, that tells you what you're dealing with. That tells you the kind of America, the face of America in this particular moment, because America goes through all kinds of, we're like a teenager or something, you know, like we're always going through something.
Thank you. Yeah, but that's the challenge that I'm facing, that I'm even like with us, even in FSM, between the different islands, we have our own challenges. We don't always see eye to eye on certain things and how we deal with the outside world. Even having a national government adds another layer and a bureaucracy and even more red tape. So even in the region, that if of negotiating as a bloc is a big challenge. It's a big ask.
It's worth the effort, though, because like the strategic picture, it's one of the only things that I could see that would make a difference, you know.
The important point, and I think that point manifests itself in the way that the different leaders of the different entities that exist within the Micronesian region have never really attempted to do, which is when they actually gather together and the MIF, they think of their own issues, and you pointed it out. Sometimes Guam issues or CNMI issues think that they can resolve those issues just in some kind of special relationship, like the CNMI relationship with the federal government is somehow more special or a different kind of special than the Guam relationship, and then the COFA, all the COFA agreements, of course, are spread apart. I think you're really right. The U.S. looks at this area as a block to own, to manage, not to own. I mean, they own part of it already, but I mean to manage, to manage, and the block itself doesn't see itself that way. And I think there needs to be a level of maturation that brings us to that point. I think we have. This is pretty much wraps up the session. Thank you so much, Van. As always, you know, I urge everyone to go to YouTube and look at some of your appearances and your statements, because you always have a lot to say, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.